everybody. Welcome to the next episode of our speaker series. Today, I'm very honored to be joined by Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Prime Minister of Norway. She was also the WHO Director, and more recently, she was also the UN Special Envoy on Climate Change. Prime Minister, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Good evening.
We want to start off this discussion with touching upon sustainable development and Agenda 2030. Agenda 2030, which this year will be celebrating its fifth birthday, as the resolution was adopted in 2015 by the General Assembly. And in 1987, you led a commission which published a report which defined sustainable development, and this definition was widely used in the years to come. Now being in 2020, I want to ask you first and foremost, to what extent does the very idea of sustainable development, as was identified by you in 1987, how does that relate and how does that match to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we are dealing with today?
Well, it took, of course, a long time from our report, Our Common Future in 87, before 2015. So I often say that, but in historical terms, this is nearly 30 years. Mm-hmm. But when you think about it, and you consider that the world has nearly 200 countries and as many leaders that have to agree on a common text and a common perspective, then really I feel that yes, the goals are addressing the same kinds of issues that are covered in our report, and if they are followed, then we will really move forward in a very constructive way.
Well, I think following the Sustainable Development Goals, that this is where the role of non-governmental organizations and civil society comes into play. We recently did a discussion with the former UN Human Rights Chief, who said that if we had, followed the agenda, if we had been close to attaining the targets, the current pandemic that we are battling with wouldn't have been as severe. The consequences wouldn't have been as severe as they are today. And this leads me on nicely onto my next question. From the perspective of a former Prime Minister, head of government, from the perspective of also a former World Health Organization director, how would you evaluate the world's response to this global pandemic? And what, in your eyes, went well, but what must be improved in the future in order to avoid such catastrophic consequences?
Well, I think it is fair to say that the world was certainly not prepared in the way it should have been. We have had several warnings. You can go 100 years back to the Spanish flu, but you can go only in this century with SARS, MERS, Ebola. We have had repeated outbreaks that really need coordinated responses, and that really illustrates the necessity of preparedness, which is why panels have advised and recommended considerable increases in preparedness in specific ways where accountability comes into the question. What have countries done to follow up all these promises and commitments that in fact have been done over the last 10 years? Now, what we have seen is that most countries were not as prepared as they should have been. We made a warning in September last year from the first report from the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, telling about the big risk of a respiratory pathogen like the one we now have with corona. And of course, it took only two and a half months after that before the first cases of COVID-19 happened in China. Now, this illustrates that no, the preparedness is absolutely not what it should have been. On the more positive side, then, you can say that due to some of the earlier experiences and using technology and science more quickly than before, the virus was identified in a laboratory, and the knowledge of that virus was spread quickly across the world to scientific and other health institutions, so that tests could be made, and that vaccine research and then gradually vaccine trials are much more ahead this time than in earlier cases. So there is a lot to say negatively, but there are also some positives.
Yeah, I think it is indeed a very complex situation that we're in at the moment, where sort of one solution is connected to another, but also each problem is connected with one another, which is also why I think it's so very difficult to come up with a coordinated response. But I do think more needs to be done on also a region level, for instance, at the European Union level, where different countries have completely different mechanisms as to how one should perform when they have symptoms. In the Netherlands, for example, if you just have a slight cough, you immediately have to go get tested. In Poland, on the other hand, unless your symptoms are very, very severe, or you had direct contact with someone that has been diagnosed or that has come positive, then unless you have that, then you really shouldn't be too worried. And I think this coordination, like you mentioned, is indeed what's missing. I do want to now move on to a slightly more broad topic and sort of reform of international organizations such as the United Nations. We know that the United States in recent time, they've withdrew from the Human Rights Council. They've initiated they've halted the funding of the WHO. We know the tensions in the World Trade Organizations. They've also withdrew from UNESCO. And that has, again, caused the re-emergence of the discussion about reform of institutions such as the United Nations and more specifically the Security Council. What is your view on that? Do we need to reform the UN? And if so, how? What direction should we take?
Well, all of this boils down to leadership in every country, but certainly leadership in the large countries that really dominate our institutions. However, however they are built and their constitutions, they are all dependent on the support of nations, of countries. And so, if you have a good idea about how our institutions could be better, if they had been made differently, yes, that can be interesting, but it doesn't help as long as the main problem is the lack of common understanding and common willingness to work together across national borders. This is what has been lacking in the last few years, that we have seen conflict specifically between China and the United States, but also, as you mentioned, that the United States has chosen to withdraw from a number of critical international collaborations and institutions as such. Now, that situation cannot be solved. There's no way to see that the US would agree to a reform that would increase other countries' strength in moving towards more international collaboration. The point is that nationalism has been increasing over the last 5-10 years, not only in the US, but some other places as well, even in Europe. So we need leadership at local and national level, and we need leadership that can work together, because we are in this together, and we have to be able to create common good. This is common public goods that cannot be created without nations working together.
I think those are some really, really important words there that also echo what we've heard in our series of discussions. It's something very similar that the Prime Minister of Bhutan, Tshering Tobgay, had said about leadership, and I'm so very happy that you echo that, because I do think that words coming from such exceptional individuals like yourself can indeed make even a small difference. But it's, one block at a time, as I like to say. I do now want to come back to sustainable development and Agenda 2030, which is absolutely critical in our time. We've seen several different reports where some indicators and some targets we're on the way to achieve them, whereas at some we're not very close at all. And I wanted to ask you, based on your expertise in the area of sustainable development, what would you say in practical terms? What can we as a global community, as NGOs, as civil society, as governments do in order to accelerate the way forward, in order for us to be able to achieve these indicators and these targets that are highlighted underneath each of the 17 SDGs?
Hopefully, many more people, also leaders, have learned a lesson, have seen the interdependence between nations in a situation like this one, where a virus really takes hold across the world, irrespective of political leadership or anything. It's all over, and we cannot get out of it without doing it together. Because if a number of countries are left behind, for instance, not being have ability to vaccine their health personnel, this virus will live on much longer in parts of the world and be reinstituted, into the countries that may have been able to overcome. So I think the illustration that the corona crisis gives us has probably increased the possibility of more people, more leaders, to realize the fact that we are in this together, and that unless you have all people in a situation where they can collaborate, where they can be part of the solution, where they have the basis for, health, education, access, well, all the human rights, then societies are undermined by a situation like this. Hopefully, people will be more mindful of how dependent we are on each other. And to get through that and into a new future, you need to follow the path of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think collectivism is indeed the main message here, and that we need to realize that that we are in this together. Absolutely. Moving on to my last question, because I do not want to take too much of your time. We do see that some countries, mainly those in Scandinavia, but also Australia, Canada, New Zealand, for example, but also, of course, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands. Those are countries that are always thought of as the ones which are on the right path to materialize the very idea of sustainable development, that they are on the right path to attaining all the different indicators and targets. Now, other countries are a bit further away. And I wanted to ask, why do you think that is? And is it that economics and the economic situation in the country is the only reason behind that? Or do you see other influencing mechanisms here?
Well, I certainly don't think it's economics. Mm-hmm. If you move towards an inclusive society where everyone has a chance in life, you increase productivity, you increase national GDP, because frankly, everyone is involved, everyone can participate and contribute to building the nation and to building, a society that takes care of all, and also is a prosperous society. Now, if you don't think in those terms, and if you have great inequality, then those aspects are not taken care of. If you build a society on inclusiveness and involving everybody and giving everyone rights, then that will build a better economy, and that will at the same time be a more sustainable society. So it's a question of values and policies and what kinds of use you make of democracy and of sharing the effects of all that is done in a society. Investments, output shared. You have a taxation system where the rich do their fair share, and that you reach everybody, and that all children grow up in a society that is secure and safe, and that they have education and health from the very beginning. But those societies are built on those kinds of values. That's why they succeed. Yeah. So for me, in a way, it may be funny that I say that, but for me, this is social democracy seen in an international broad perspective. Social and democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think here when we mention this topic, we also again do in a way come back to the very idea of collectivism, but also burden sharing, right? And that is indeed very, very true. Prime Minister, again, thank you very much for joining us today. It was an immense pleasure, a great honor, and I think you really do pinpoint some of the crucial issues here that our listeners will hopefully take away in their daily life. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you. And everyone can make an effort in this case.